Over the next few years, bots will pervade our lives more and more. These smart conversational text interfaces provide a new way of engaging with the computer systems that we've been mostly interacting with through web and mobile app interfaces for the last decade. Bots are a necessary complement to the voice interfaces of the future because we don't always want to talk to the computer, and natural language processing is not yet good enough to always translate our vocal requests accurately. Bots are not toys, they aren't trivial, and they aren't going away anytime soon. Jon Bruner is the host of the O'Reilly Bots podcast, a show that has quickly become one of my favorites because it covers both theoretical and applied artificial intelligence while remaining approachable to listen to. Jon hosts it with Pete Skomoroch, who works on a bot startup full-time, and Jon and Pete were also the organizers of O'Reilly Bot Day, which I enjoyed tremendously. I got a lot of knowledge from, so thank you to O'Reilly. And thanks to Jon for being a guest on this show. I hope you enjoyed this episode. When I'm choosing the tools for my side projects, the first thing that I look for is ease of use. That's why I love MongoDB. It is the most popular non-relational database, and it is super easy to use. At the beginning of a project, I often don't know the shape of my objects, and Mongo makes it easy to evolve the database schema as I like over time. Over time, as my project gets popular, I'm going to need to scale, and thankfully, MongoDB has built-in horizontal scalability, but configuration and database maintenance aren't really what I want to spend my time on. Thankfully, MongoDB Atlas was released in 2016. MongoDB Atlas is the easiest way to get access to MongoDB without having to run the database yourself. You pay only for what you use, from small projects all the way up to large production deployments. To try MongoDB Atlas today, go to mongodb.com/sedaily and get a free $25 in credit. Use promo code GOATLAS25 to get that $25 in free credit. Atlas is the only hosted MongoDB service built by the engineers behind the database, the company MongoDB. With Atlas, you get end-to-end encryption, you get VPC peering, you get access to the latest releases, and for a limited time, you can go to mongodb.com/sedaily, enter promo code GOATLAS25, and get that $25 in credit and get started with MongoDB Atlas. Thanks to MongoDB for being a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily, and thanks for being the database behind a lot of my favorite side projects in the past. We're really happy to have MongoDB as a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. Jon Bruner is a host of the O'Reilly Bots podcast. Jon, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to be here.
Bots are important, and over the next few years, we're going to see them pervade our lives more and more. And this was something that I didn't really understand before I started to listen to the Bots podcast, which you host with Pete Skomoroch. Why are bots becoming more prominent?
Well, Jeff, there are a couple of things going on here. One is that the way that people use their mobile phones is changing. You might think that almost 10 years now after the release of the iPhone and 8 or so years after the release of the App Store, people would be downloading apps all the time and using their phones to their fullest extents. But it turns out that the app economy is really stagnating, that it's become very difficult to get people to download new mobile apps and get involved in sort of new mobile practices. And it turns out that most users of iPhones and Android smartphones, especially younger people, are really just using them for messaging, for IM and for texting through platforms like SMS and WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger and Snapchat. So that's one thing that makes bots appealing, that you could have these little fragments of software living in a chat application that a few years ago you might have put into a standalone app. But now no one's downloading standalone apps anymore. Everyone just wants to use messaging on their phones.
It is similar to the idea of everything being moved into the web browser and you don't have to download any software. You just access everything through a web app.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, when's the last time you downloaded and installed a desktop application for your personal computer? It sounds so old, right?
Well, okay, so there's certainly these existential changes that are going on. Is that the only thing that's going on here, or because the idea of bots have been around for a long time? I mean, are there other things in the water right now that are causing bots to become more prominent?
Yeah, you're totally right. The idea has been around for a while. The other thing is the emergence of practical artificial intelligence. So the AI landscape has changed really dramatically in the last few years between much cheaper computing in the cloud and ubiquitous connectivity that make it possible to connect to that really cheap computing. Plus, there have been a lot of advancements in the software techniques for artificial intelligence. So it's getting a lot easier to write software that can interpret human language and make sense of it and then come back with a response that makes sense.
Are the bots a new interface for old applications that have been around for a while, or is it a platform that unlocks completely new functionality?
There are a lot of people developing bots that basically reproduce existing app functionality, things like bots that'll book you travel reservations or bots that'll check the weather for you and tell you what's going on. But there are also some new applications, things that haven't been handled well by software so far that look like they'll be compelling use cases for bots. Things like scheduling meetings. For the last few years, a lot of people have developed things that, websites where you can go and you can send someone a link and say, hey, let's meet up, choose a time from my calendar here, and this web page will kind of mediate our schedules. Things like that have never caught on, but now we have stuff like Clara and X.AI, which are bot assistants that you CC on your email, and then they jump in the way that a personal assistant would and kind of facilitate a meeting. So that's arguably a new application for software that might really catch on.
What's the general case that we can extrapolate there? So like you point out X.AI and Clara as these good scheduling interfaces. You schedule a calendar event with somebody, instead of having to go back and forth, you use the bot, which intermediates some of that. But what is the generalizable characteristic there that we can observe about these scheduling bots that makes it more effective than the web interface that we might be able to extrapolate to other applications?
Oh, that's a really good way of putting the question. It's these are bits of software that communicate with users in human terms. So you're not asking users to use a computer interface. You're asking them to interact with the software the way that they're used to interacting with humans.
You launched the Bots podcast about 3 months ago, I think, 3 or 4 months ago.
Yeah, I think it was back in August 2016.
How has your opinion of bots changed over that period of time?
I've actually become a lot more positive about bots since then in talking to people who are creating bots and creating the underlying technologies and platforms.
You were a skeptic.
I was a bit of a skeptic, yeah. It felt like something that was beginning to arrive in terms of the underlying technology, but in talking to the creators of this stuff and talking to people who are using bots, I've become more convinced about their commercial prospects and sort of social prospects.
Yeah, so I remember, I think it was like 3 or 4 months ago, I was sitting at a table at a restaurant in San Francisco with some of my friends who are all in tech, and I was the only person at the table who was saying, like, no, I think these bots are actually usul. Everybody else at the table was saying, oh, there's all this venture capital money going into bots. It's all just wasted money. I mean, look, in all fairness, it hasn't really borne out in any direction yet. There's been a lot of investment. There's, as you and I have seen in doing interviews with people and seeing those cool presentations at Bot Day, there is something here. It's not absolutely nothing, but it is unclear as of yet if the investment is overheated right now.
That's right. Yeah, and it certainly looks like a trend that popped up out of nowhere. It was under a year ago, maybe roughly a year ago, that you started to see sort of the classic beginning of it, which is a handful of well-distributed venture capital essayists, beginning to talk about the possibility of bots and this kind of software interface. And then There followed a lot of Medium posts. And back in June, I went to a great small bot conference called Botness. It's a community event that folks from the big platforms and some of the startups all work together on. And even back in June, people were sitting at this gathering in San Francisco and going like, "Ugh, bots are over, man." And it was ridiculous. There's a way that I think the community gets skeptical of things that arise very quickly. And then you're right that there haven't been any runaway successes. There haven't been any exits, certainly. There haven't been any, actually there have been a couple of big acquisitions. Viv was acquired by Samsung a couple of months ago. And API.ai was acquired by Google. But for the most part, you haven't seen this really, bear fruit in a dramatic way. So people are naturally a little skeptical because it came up quickly and seemed to go everywhere.
This is, of course, the problem of following efficient market hypothesis and tracking investments like they are a direct reflection of reality rather than a distorted reflection of reality. And I think another example of this is Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. You talk to even people who invest in Bitcoin, and they'll say something like, Bitcoin, there's no killer app. And the reality is that the infrastructure is not there. The theoretical underpinnings of Bitcoin are very powerful, and that's not going to change. There is something there. It's the same thing with these chat interfaces. Whether the ecosystem underpinnings are going to develop anytime soon or not is up for debate. But it's just a nascent field, and a lot has to go right for the stars to align, for it to get mass adoption. For something, and then you have all these other things that could potentially intermediate it. Augmented reality comes to mind. If augmented reality becomes big, maybe that totally changes our perspective for the interfaces that we want to be engaging with. But so thinking about the Bitcoin thing, like I think about the relationship, or the comparison between Bitcoin and the Bots podcast. I think like starting the Bots podcast 3 months ago is kind of like starting a Bitcoin podcast 5 or 6 years ago, where there's like a few people who are involved in bots, and if you spend a lot of time in that community, it might seem like everybody's talking about bots, but in reality, there's just like a few people who are authorities, a few people who are tinkering with it. For the most part, engineers are not thinking much about bots. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. It's really right now in the stage of, a lot of, there are a handful of startups in this area. A lot of investors are interested in investing in companies in this area, but haven't yet done so. And then among the bigger companies, it's something that's kind of on the horizon for like R&D groups that are charged with, familiarizing themselves with kind of the next thing. They're commissioning some, trials, especially companies that deal a lot with customer service, like airlines, are really interested in this. But it's not something where you see developers racing to add bot development to their stack, and there are a few reasons for that. I mean, it's not a hugely widespread phenomenon yet, and also it requires a skill set that's slightly different from. Actually considerably different from web development. You need to know something about AI, something about sort of linear user interfaces that are a bit different from the UIs on the web.
Your company runs on Apple devices. Developers use Apple laptops, project managers use iPads, and everyone uses an iPhone. Jamf Now is a cloud-based mobile device management solution for iPads, iPhones, and Macs in your workplace. Jamf Now makes device management accessible and affordable for everyone, so businesses can support their users without help from the IT department. With Jamf Now, you can configure settings on all of your Apple devices quickly and consistently over the air, and Jamf Now allows you to manage your devices by centrally deploying apps anytime from anywhere. You can create a free account today at jamf.com/sedaily. That's jamf.com/sedaily. Use Jamf now to ensure that the sensitive company information that your employees access on their Apple devices remains secure. Enforce passcodes and encryption over the air. Even remotely lock or wipe a device. See how easy it is to set up, manage, and secure your Apple devices anytime from anywhere. Manage your first 3 devices for free, and you can add more for just $2 per device per month. Create your free account today at jamf.com/sedaily. That's jamf.com/sedaily. So with that in mind, what's the state of the tooling? Because the comparison to web apps is interesting. Building a chatbot versus building a web app. If you want to build a web app today, whether or not you have much experience in it, you can spend a weekend with Ruby on Rails following a Rails tutorial, and you can learn how to build a simple web app. But my sense is that with the bot ecosystem, despite the fact that, ostensibly, well, in some light, building a bot is more straightforward. It's just this text interface. Despite that, it seems like you still kind of need to piece together all of these different tools today. There's not really like a Ruby on Rails for building a bot.
Right. There are a few frameworks that make it a little bit easier. Howdy is one of the really popular ones. There's also the Microsoft Bot framework that do some of the work of, abstracting the interaction with the platform, so that you basically just say like send message, here's the message, and then it takes care of it. That's especially true of the bot platform from Microsoft, which works across a lot of different messaging platforms. And the messaging platforms themselves are evolving really quickly to become easier for developers to use. That wasn't necessarily one of the concerns that they had when they launched these things a few years ago. But they've all really aggressively added functionality that can appeal to developers. The tricky gap right now is really in the AI and the natural language understanding, the NLU. That's an area that requires some skills that are a bit different from straightforward web development. And there are some services, sort of AI as a service platforms that'll help you with that. But after you get past the very early kind of wireframe stage, most bot creators find that they have to build their own AI in some respect, at least to work with any kind of specialized application.
What does that term AI mean in this context?
So the artificial intelligence that's able to understand free text input and generate responses. So it usually these platforms offer some sort of entity extraction in particular. So they'll have tools where it'll take free text and it'll look for a date and time that's being mentioned and return a well-defined date-time object from it, or look for is this answer essentially yes or essentially no? If someone writes nah, does that mean then it'll return like a false object, and if they say yup, it'll return a true object.
You talk about this NLP NLU stuff. You may have to build a proficiency in it if you want to get your bot really good. Is the technology there? I mean, even if you have a great proficiency in it, even if you're at the cutting edge, is the NLU at the in the best applications? Is it good enough to provide a good enough user experience?
This is something that a lot of people in the bot world talk about. Why Siri is so frustrating and not used very much versus why the Amazon Echo has been such a huge success. And the thinking often goes along the lines that Siri kind of overpromises and underdelivers, and the Echo does the opposite. So Siri gives you the sense, somehow through a series of little cues, through its advertising, that you can throw anything at it and it'll come back with a brilliant answer. And it often sort of teases you with like a snarky answer. The Echo, on the other hand, basically goes in with the promise that it'll tell you what time it is and handle timers in your kitchen and convert between units. And then you discover gradually that it has all of these other capabilities that are really incredible. So it's not just the quality of the AI, it's also the quality of the design that guides the user in how to use the AI.
Okay, so we're getting into the speech interface competition discussion, and this is not a consumer electronics podcast, but I just want to ask, and I just want to go there for a bit, even though there are so many other podcasts that have this conversation, and I'm sure people can go listen to many, many other shows that will go into this discussion. But from a technological standpoint, and from a business standpoint, we're both armchair critics of what goes on in business and technology. I've heard that narrative, the idea that Siri overpromises, underdelivers. I think there are other explanations. Even if you had not seen any marketing for Siri and you used it, and then you used Alexa or even Google Home, you'd just be like, this is so much worse. It's just astoundingly worse. I think it's a lot of it is there's something like the speaker is not good enough, or there's some weird latency issues that are non-intuitive compared to the latency of Alexa versus Siri is so much better. And I remember, I don't know if you read this article, there was some article that came out about how Bezos was involved in the development of Alexa, and he was basically like, look, latency is going to be really, really, really important here.
Oh yeah.
And I think that was like a killer. That was a killer insight. That how important the quickness of the response was, and how hard they worked to get that latency down. And I think it's evident that the Siri development has struggled there, because I'm sure I don't think when everybody is criticizing Siri, I don't think we're telling Apple anything that they don't know. It just must be really, really hard to iron out that kind of you can't put the genie back in the bottle. You can't it's probably really hard to refactor it to get the latency down significantly.
Yeah, if you're comparing Siri to both the Echo and to Google Now, the advantage that the Echo has is that it's plugged in, so its initial latency is always going to be outstanding because it can draw just a little bit more power in order to always be sort of on standby. And in the case of Google, Google's advantage is that it has the entire web to learn from. And I think one of the successful things about Google Now that always disappoints me when I use Siri is Google Now is sort of natively oriented toward performing a web search. So it falls back onto just showing you a page of Google results, which is often actually what you want. Siri kind of has this approach where it's I'm gonna answer this question from my own internal context, and if I can't, then I will grudgingly show you a list of search engine results for your query.
So just to touch on the consumer gadgets a little more, I had an Amazon Alexa, and then I returned it because I saw the announcement for the Google Home, and I just assumed that the Google Home would be better, and then I got it, and I've kind of been underwhelmed by it compared to the Alexa. I had a much better experience with the Alexa. I thought it was interesting because I used Google Now, the phone version, back when I had an Android device, and it was awesome. But there's some gap in the usability for the Google Home. I don't know. Have you had the same experience?
That's interesting. I've only ever used a Google Home in a store setting. So I haven't played with one at home, but I was reasonably impressed by it in the store. There was someone sort of guiding me in suggesting queries to give it, so that might have had something to do with it. But do you find it's less flexible, or seems to learn less? Or
I think it's okay, this is actually a very specific critique of it, but the main thing is that for some reason it doesn't integrate with Google Apps for Work account. So I can't integrate my Gmail from a work account. Most of my emails go through Jeff at softwareengineeringdaily.com, and for some reason it doesn't integrate with a work account, and that has prevented me from personalizing it. So this is a totally biased deviation. Okay. Anyway, we should talk more about bots.
One other question about the assistant.
Oh, sure.
So how are the plugins? Do you see a good, universe of skills, so to speak, available for it?
Yeah, plugins have actually been awesome. And the experience where you search Google for like recipe for braised short ribs or something, and it gives you like the card, so you don't have to go to recipes.com or whatever, you know, bloated adware site you're going to go to. You know, you don't have to experience that. You just get a card. That experience has been awesome. And you're really seeing like the advantages of Google doing this thing where they just extract information from a site and give no ad revenue to that site. So that's been awesome. There's also like integration with Quora, and I love Quora. And so there's been a couple times where like I ask it a question. It's like, according to Quora, something, or according to Product Hunt, according to Wikipedia. And the integrations there have been really smooth. But what I will say is there's just been a lot of times where Google simply says, I don't know how to help you with that. And I remember the graceful degradation of Alexa being a little smoother.
Huh.
So
yeah, Alexa also has a few different failure modes that are really interesting. And we discussed this once on the Bots podcast with Kathy Pearl, who's a voice user interface designer. The Amazon Echo has kind of these three different responses if it doesn't understand what you said. There's the voice that says, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that command or something, or I didn't understand your question. And then there's another one where it kind of goes like, ba-doop. It makes a little sound, and it's like, I think you said something, but I'm not sure. I'm just going to turn off. And then there's a third one where it's listening, and then the light just goes off, and it doesn't do anything.
Right.
So yeah, it has this very graceful, well thought out series of failures. And
I realize now I missed that. Yeah, Google has a simplified degradation thing. So okay, getting back to the Bot podcast, what are the themes that you're seeing emerge as you host more episodes?
I'd say the core themes, these are really meta themes. Are how early this whole environment is, how and sort of sub theme is the degree to which everyone is just experimenting with this stuff right now, just sort of throwing ideas out, seeing if they get some users, seeing what the reaction is, inventing new products, sort of to test. Some of them seem a little trivial, but they are, you know, you have to have some trivial use cases so that you can understand the environment. And then, you know, sub-theme two is how quickly all of this is developing. And especially if you talk with the people who work for the big platforms, Microsoft and Google and Slack and Amazon, they've really been putting a lot of resources into supporting bot developers over the last 6 months to a year. Really, the developer tools have been available to the public since kind of last spring in most of these cases, like March, April, May. So they're developing incredibly fast. Every week brings some significant new revision to one of the platforms or toolkits. So that's something we talk about a lot. We also talk about the user interface aspects and what sorts of provisions people make to help the users figure out how to use the bots. This is a huge headache for a lot of people who have backgrounds in web development or other forms of more traditional software development, where you can create a drop-down menu or a list of buttons that show the user the affordances of the software. You know, you can click here to search by time. You can click here to search by city. You can click here to open up additional options. But when you have a bot, it becomes really tiresome to say, how would you like to search? You can say search by city. You can say search by time, right? So there's this real art to communicating to the user how they should go about using a bot.
Are there any particular episodes that come to mind that really changed how you thought about this space?
Well, actually, the very first episode that Pete and I recorded, which was kind of just a download with the two of us, where we talked about what we had been thinking about with respect to bots and how we saw the area developing and why we were launching the podcast. That was one of the most informative conversations that I've had, because I got to basically sort of push Pete into explaining himself and his interest in bots, and he's a really sharp analyst of this area. So it was And of course, I learn a lot by trying to explain things to other people. So that was a really clarifying experience. And we were trying to give the listeners some sense of why we were interested in bots and why we thought they were exciting. So it was great to be able to sort of compile that and talk through it. There were a couple others as well. The one that we recorded with Kathy Pearl that I've mentioned before about voice user interface and the challenges there.
And even the idea that there is this new user experience that we have to design for. And we think of design often as a visual thing. This is more about text and experience.
That's right. Yeah. Super lightweight visual experience, really. And highly constrained, too, because the messaging platforms don't give you a lot of leeway to develop your own user interface. It's much more limited than what you would be able to do in any kind of web development.
You had Joshua Browder on, and I actually had him on my show recently as well.
Terrific.
Because I saw him at Bot Day, and I heard his show with you, and he is a fascinating character. And I find his startup, Do Not Pay, or I don't even know if you want to call it a startup, his product, Do Not Pay, it helps you pay for parking tickets, or contest parking tickets, I'm sorry. And it's interesting, not necessarily to me because of its impact, although it is impactful. It's like he's helping people contest parking tickets in a really easy way. But what I found so interesting about talking to him is he had a really good explanation for one thing that is different about the interface of a bot. And just this idea that it's this, his model, for his early model for the bot, at least, and how it exists mostly now, is basically it's just this huge static decision tree. And it's hidden behind a simple text interface. But that's what it is. Like, you're basically navigating a decision tree with a text interface. And that was his presentation of why a bot, here is one way a bot can be useful. Like, why would you want to navigate this huge static decision tree using a website? That's not a good experience. But the idea that you're just doing it through this text interface is really simplifying. And I think it maybe gets at the idea of, these interfaces that we've had in the past where you call into a call center. It's like dial 1 for X, and that's just going down a decision tree, and it's like, okay, now you're faced with another question. Dial 3 for Y.
Right. Yeah, the old IVR systems on the phone. It's an analogy that comes up a lot with people who build bots. Joshua is incredibly bright, and he really did hit on something that could be simplified very effectively into just a text-based back and forth. You think about, you don't need any images for that sort of thing. You just need someone to sort of ask you these decision tree questions, and it makes a lot of sense to go through linearly rather than having some website that's, type in the name of your city, then hit next. Type in where you were parked, then hit next. Also, he makes a good point, or his product makes a good point, which is that there's probably plenty of other low-hanging fruit that bot builders could create that essentially doesn't have AI in it. The Do Not Pay bot doesn't use deep learning or anything like that, as far as I know. It's able to do this really important work just with decision trees. And there are probably plenty of other applications that don't involve AI.
Speaking of Joshua, he was one of the speakers at Bot Day, which I attended. What were your takeaways from Bot Day?
So at Bot Day, I was really interested in talking to the people who came and asking them about the work that they're doing and the impression that they have of the bots field and how that changed over the course of the day. So because I was a little bit of a skeptic going in, and I've been gradually getting more positive about bots and now feel quite positive about them, I expected that everyone who came to Bot Day would be sort of a borderline skeptic. And I also thought that over the course of a whole day of talks about the challenges and tools for building bots, that people might be more skeptical at the end of the day than they were at the beginning of the day. But we did kind of a show of hands at the beginning of the day and asked people if they really believe in bots. And most hands went up. And then at the end of the day, we asked people if they believe in bots more or less now than they did when they came in. And just about everyone in the room said they believe in bots more. So having been presented with this like rundown of the technical challenges and overviews of the infrastructure that you have to build and so on, people were actually more positive about bots. And that's been my feeling as I've looked at this stuff. It makes bots kind of concrete. You can begin to see the path that you would take to building bots and implementing them, and you can think about applications. Whereas maybe 6 months ago, when people like Mark Zuckerberg and Satya Nadella were saying, hey, you can build a bot and it can take care of your stuff. Maybe you can order a pizza with a bot. It was hard then to believe in it, because it was like, yeah, sure, whatever. We'll have AI that'll like order us pizza, I guess, but that doesn't sound very interesting. Once you can start to grasp it in a really tangible way, I think you can start to imagine how you would apply it, and you can start to see the roadmap to building it out.
Were there any other interesting anecdotes that you saw or heard at Bot Day because there's all these people from around the industry probably engaging with each other for the first time. Did you see any interesting cross-pollinations?
Well, I think one of the things that stood out to me is the sort of the breadth of applications that people were talking about. So we had some people there from consumer-facing roles at financial services companies, and similar organizations who were interested in building bots that could like handle customer questions. And then at the other end, we also had a lot of people who were building completely internal bots to sort of aid employees. And the range of those was huge too. You could have a bot that helps out someone who's doing telephone customer service inside a call center, or a bot that sits in the IT department's Slack installation and sends alerts to people and sort of dispatches requests and stuff like that. So the breadth of applications that attendees were interested in was really interesting, and I saw that when I watched some of the interactions. People, someone who's building a customer service bot talking with someone who's building an IT ticket dispatching bot for internal use. These are very different cases, and they have very different requirements. So the bot world is going to be very broad.
I had a conversation with somebody who was sitting next to me at Bot Day about NLP, and we were talking about his startup basically was I think it was an NLP deep learning startup. So basically something around using deep learning to power better NLP. And I didn't really, it was something where like I had heard that before and I didn't really know what that meant. Like, cause I always heard like deep learning is great for classification problems where you have a huge corpus of examples and you use the corpus of examples to power improvements in building that model, where you don't necessarily have to give features that describe an image of a cat, but by virtue of having so many images of a cat, you extract the features from that using deep learning. And I didn't really understand how that was applicable to NLP, but then he explained it to me, and just the idea that you can do classification of text in a similar way that you would classify images. You by virtue of having a large enough corpus of data, and I heard something similar to this on the I can't remember if it was your podcast or Ben Lorica's data podcast, where there was I think the phrase was "text is the new images," with regard to how deep learning is being applied to natural language processing. Have you heard this at all?
Yeah, I think that might have been in our latest episode with Richard Socher, who founded MetaMind. There's a lot of interest in using deep learning with text. A couple of months ago, Google released a model for parsing sentences using deep learning. You can find it. They've informally called it Parsey McParseface. I forget what the actual name of the project is, but it was very exciting when it came out. And you're right, a lot of the techniques are similar in the abstract to how you would analyze and classify images. You can also use deep learning to generate content, as we see with things like the deep dream algorithm that turns images into collections of other weird images. So there's a lot of interest in that too, using deep learning and neural networks to sort of generate sentences that sound plausible and contain some information that you're trying to convey.
So you've got a bacon delivery service, and you need to notify your customers when their bacon has arrived at their doorstep. Twilio helps you make sure your customers get the bacon while it's hot. Twilio's programmable API lets you build SMS or voice alerts easily in the programming language of your choice, all in under 5 minutes with only a few lines of code. Now your customers get a text or a call the instant their bacon is ready. If your customers want to see the bacon frying on a hot pan, Twilio has video APIs and SDKs for the platforms that you know and love. Learn more at go.twilio.com/podcast and get an additional $10 when you sign up and upgrade your account. That's go.twilio.com/podcast. You will only pay for what you use, and it costs less than a penny to send a text. Get started at go.twilio.com/podcast. Get your bacon delivery service cooking with Twilio's APIs for voice, SMS, and video. Speaking of artificial sentences that sound plausible, there was this, bots affecting politics thing that we had on Twitter recently, where during the election there were all these bots that were arguing, is it possible to tell a bot presidential campaign candidate supporter from a non-bot presidential campaign supporter? Do you feel like that actually had any effect on the outcome of the election?
I think fake social media bots probably played some role in the outcome of the election. The other probably more impactful thing was the kind of spread of fake news, which is right now the hottest topic in all of natural language processing. Everyone is interested in trying to figure out if there are algorithmic approaches to discovering, fake news on Facebook and other social networks. Social bots can have an impact because they can kind of, seed and stimulate discussions. They can take, they can kind of rev things up at the outset. If you tweet something and it's controversial and no one sees it in the first 5 minutes, then it just disappears forever. If you tweet something and an army of 10,000 bots retweet it over the next 3 hours, then suddenly it becomes like a trending topic and a lot of people see it, and it appears to have sort of weight and legitimacy. It gives these subtle cues that social media readers can interpret to mean that the statement was correct or worth considering. So I think those bots can have an impact on the way we see social media users, like the president-elect.
It is somewhat dystopian, but this is like, speaking personally, my response is just to, like, I guess add give some measured skepticism to anything I see on the internet, and I think one thing that's interesting is just it really heightens the value of these media institutions that, New York Times or Washington Post or whatever, these institutions that have this built-in fact-checking. There was a period of time where I was like, who needs this fact-checking stuff? Like, just, shoot first, ask questions later. Now I am realizing that there is a real place for institutions that take their facts seriously.
Right. Yeah, and as a journalist or former journalist myself, I appreciate that a lot. I used to write for Forbes magazine between 2006 and 2012, and I remember the editing process there very fondly. There were a lot of steps of checks, and a couple of editors would read what you wrote, and the more outrageous or the more controversial your statement is, the more surprising your statement is, the more scrutiny it got from the editors. And they'd always ask for additional evidence. Even if it didn't go in the article, they wanted to see it themselves on their desk to be assured that that it was legitimate. So yeah, that kind of weight is incredibly important. And especially because all humans tend to, believe the things they want to believe. So if you're on Facebook and you see something that supports your political point of view and it's just really fun but totally implausible, there's a good chance that you'll believe it because it's just so gratifying to believe it. And the internet is tuned to provide these things, right? Especially social media is tuned to provide it, not just because of the echo chamber effect where we tend to be friends with people who agree with us, but also because the platforms themselves actually tune the news feeds to give you stuff that you'll want to click on. So they're optimized for engagement, and outrage is very, very engaging.
As a former journalist, you have thought about media a lot. What do you think of this conversation around Facebook? Like, what should is it okay for Facebook to just optimize for engagement, or does Facebook have a responsibility to break down filter bubbles to serve us news that we don't necessarily want to see, to police fake news more severely? Is there a responsibility there?
I think Facebook does have some responsibility to clean up the way that it distributes this stuff. And I'm not sure that it goes all the way to, outright filtering the kinds of links that people can share or shadow banning them, which Facebook is extremely good at doing. I think beginning with a little bit of disclosure or more disclosure would help. A couple of years ago, Facebook noticed that there were a bunch of sites, generally right-wing sites, that were, publishing articles like, House initiates impeachment proceedings against Obama, and, patently false headlines. And these sites claimed to be satire, but they were sort of tuned to produce unfunny satire that would just get sort of the far right reaches of the political spectrum excited, and they'd get millions of shares and tons of traffic. So that was the birth of the satire label that you sometimes see on Facebook. And it applies to The Onion, which is transparently satire, as well as these kind of content farms that call themselves satire, but that are really just distributing fake news that gets people excited and gets them lots of page views.
Another question about your journalistic nature. So doing this show, I transitioned from programming a fair bit as an engineer to hosting a podcast full time. I don't write code anymore, and it distances me from the experience of being an engineer. And sometimes I think like maybe I'm missing certain things because I don't experience that anymore. And perhaps it stilts my interviews in a certain way. Do you think about that at all as somebody who has, or as far as I know, you don't code much yourself these days? You can correct me if I'm wrong. But like, do you think that distorts your ability to interview engineers?
That's a really good question. I actually do try to program as much as possible. I'm a self-taught programmer. I majored in math in college, and but didn't have any formal programming training. And while I was at Forbes, I made an effort to really learn some programming skills, and I applied those by developing a lot of like interactive graphics and stuff like that. And now my programming, sort of long-term programming priority is to get into neural networks and deep learning. And so I'm doing a lot of like small demonstration projects with TensorFlow, which is really exciting. And doing that programming has given me a lot of insight that's gone into my work and into the conversations that I have with people. But I think the fundamental practice of interviewing people and understanding a field is that you find authorities whom you trust and ask them a lot of questions. And so I have, some insight from the fact that I program myself, but I think I have a lot more insight from hanging out with really bright, credible, articulate practitioners who are able to spend a lot more time programming and developing applications than I ever could. I think that's the core skill of journalism, is developing sources whom you trust and asking them questions and staying in touch with them and having them help you understand what's going on.
I certainly admire your approach of spending some spare time tinkering with neural networks. If there was something that I was going to tinker on in my spare time, actually programming, I would be doing. I would. In fact, I've really thought about doing exactly what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
What are the insights that you've gotten? Because I mean, I've done shows about TensorFlow. I've done shows about different machine learning frameworks and trying to get a grasp of this stuff. And I can make some statements, like what the statement I made about deep learning. Okay, it's this procedure for extracting features where and you don't have to do this labeling as much. You can get you can just use virtue of lots of data to label that, but I don't actually know what that means in terms of implementation. So what are some of the insights that you've gained by actually tinkering with that stuff?
That's a great question. There are a few different categories of insights that I've really enjoyed. One of them is that it's illuminated some of the abstract math that I learned in college. And this is something that's happened at a few points. Taking economics classes and reading about economics really illuminated calculus for me and its applications and its significance. And developing graphics really illuminated geometry for me and trigonometry. And I was like, and anytime I created an interactive graphic, I'd find myself like writing out in pencil these trigonometric transformations, sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, stuff like that that you might remember from like high school geometry. And so it really illuminated that and brought it to life. Right now, deep learning is illuminating and enlivening linear algebra for me, which was always my least favorite part of my math degree. And it's really, really gratifying. It's also stitching together some statistics for me and helping me see some aspects of kind of regressions as well. In terms of applying, and I'm really fascinated by content generation with neural networks, and so I'm playing with some stuff there, and I've stumbled across some interesting properties of neural networks. For instance, that if you can train a neural network to recognize digits, the digits 0 through 9, and then it's possible to create by sort of reverse engineering the network an image that looks to the network like it's an image of the number 3, but to a human is just an image of noise. So you're kind of like exploiting the heuristics that the neural network has developed as it's getting trained. As with humans, you can trick humans in exactly the same way. And like Daniel Kahneman wrote about this, take advantage of the heuristic corners that humans develop and sort of trick them. You can do the same thing with neural networks.
So as we draw to a close, given that you're a fellow podcaster, I'd love to hear what are your thoughts on podcasting and where is it going? This is fairly unrelated to software engineering, but everybody's listening to a podcast right now, so they might be curious. I mean, what are your podcast listening habits? Where do you think the industry is going? I heard Stephen Dubner recently say that he thinks we're in peak podcast, whatever that means. But he invests heavily in podcasts, so it was interesting to hear him say that. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on the industry.
Yeah, it's an industry I'm really interested in as a practitioner and a listener. It strikes me as a very young industry in a lot of ways, and I can kind of understand why Dubner would say we might be at peak podcast now. Just culturally, it feels like podcasts are much more influential than they were a year ago. It's a bit like how people reacted to bots by saying like, bots are over. Everyone is talking about them. On the other hand, if you look at the amount of advertising spending that's going into podcasts, it's just a minuscule fraction of television and web advertising, and a minuscule fraction of terrestrial radio advertising. So there's a lot of room for growth. In order to grow, there need to be some technological changes. As you know, as a podcaster, podcast statistics are just the most primitive thing you have ever seen, right? I mean, podcast analytics, they're from the Stone Age. And so big advertisers are unwilling to spend a lot on podcasts when the measurement tools are so poor.
Although I've just done a bunch of shows about advertising fraud, and one of the downsides of having a lot of analytics is you get a lot of fraud in the analytics. Although we don't need to go there now, but I think if advertisers were illuminated on what they were actually spending their money on, rather than phony numbers that they're getting fed by the advertising agency, they would consider podcasts more seriously.
Yeah, no, totally. And podcasts are a very special thing. The companies that do advertise on podcasts just love it, because they associate their brands with the podcast hosts, and podcast listeners have these very intimate relationships with the hosts of the programs that they listen to. So, and
it gives them like an indie brand, like Squarespace, MailChimp,
Casper
Harry
mattresses,
Casper mattresses,
NatureBox,
right,
they're getting a lot out of it, and they're paying a lot of money for it too. The CPMs on podcasts are way higher than the CPMs on any websites. So it's it feels like it's a bit of a constrained market right now, constrained by the sort of supply of content and by the measurement and ad placement tools available. It's a really hairy issue too, right? Because in order to improve the metrics, you would need to change the clients that podcast listeners use. And Apple, who kind of sits astride the market and decides these things, hasn't indicated any interest in changing the podcasting client in iOS. And you have efforts like, NPR has its own podcasting app that you can download, and certainly they're getting much more valuable data out of that than they would out of, sort of the iTunes mechanisms.
Well, the change wouldn't actually have to be that dramatic. I've thought about this a bit, and like all that Apple would have to do is change the podcast app so that it does analytics. It records analytics whether or not the phone is online for how the user is consuming a downloaded episode, and then uploads that information next time it's connected to a network.
Right. Yeah, so that it does some self-reporting.
Because the problem right now is that you can just, like, podcasts are just downloaded automatically, or they're streamed, and those two things count as the same thing, whether or not you listen to the entire episode, whether or not you listen through the mid-roll, whether or not you listen through the second mid-roll. And so the analytics don't really go in detail, basically because the analytics begin and end at the point at which you have downloaded it, basically.
Yeah, and that's why the only companies that are willing to advertise on podcasts are companies that are doing customer acquisition and have kind of a built-in mechanism for understanding the efficacy of those ads, right? So, go to naturebox.com and type in the code software engineering daily for, 10% off your first order. So they're able to measure it. We don't yet see brand advertising on podcasts where it's like, Mercedes-Benz brings you this podcast and tells you that it's a great car and the most luxurious thing you've ever seen, or whatever, because they have no way of measuring the impact of that ad.
Yeah, with the exception of the Twit network. The Twit network has gotten Ford and Visa.
Oh, wow.
I think. And yeah, they get some brand advertisers, so it's not impossible. But yeah, I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, Jon, thanks for coming on the show. I'm a big fan of the podcast. It's been super valuable to me, and I liked Bot Day a lot as well.
Thanks so much, Jeff. It's really been a pleasure. I'm a fan of your podcast too, and it's a real treat to come on it myself.
Software Engineering Daily is having our first ever meetup in San Francisco, January 11th at Galvanize. If you live in the Bay Area and you listen to Software Engineering Daily, please come check it out. I would love to meet you. We're going to have some awesome speakers. We have Pete Hunt, who is one of the early members of the React.js team, who is now the CEO of Smite. Hasib Qureshi, who has been one of the most popular guests on Software Engineering Daily. Preeti Kasireddy, who has written about her career transition from venture capital to software engineering via Coding Bootcamp. Each one of these speakers is going to give an awesome talk, and I hope you can make it January 11th at Galvanize in San Francisco. You can sign up on meetup.com. You can also find the link on the Software Engineering Daily website, softwareengineeringdaily.com. I really hope to see you there.